It is hard to believe that this is the first day of August, but that's what my calendar says, and yours too. And so we're thankful that the Lord has brought us to this point in the year 2021. And what the remainder of the year holds, only He knows, and thankfully that's the case. But we ask His continued blessing and help, even as things are, as they always have been and always will be, challenging in many ways, if we just stop to reflect for a few moments. We've asked the question in this Bible class for the last several weeks, what is man? And by that I do not mean males as opposed to females, but collectively, what is mankind? What are we as human beings, humanity? And we've answered that question already by saying man is a spiritual being. Man is also a physical being. Man is of this dual nature, both physical and spiritual. And then we've especially kind of explored how that spiritual component of man, how it works itself out, if you will. We can understand the physical. Now, those that are medical professionals, and I know we have several in our congregation, they could explain that aspect of our makeup much better than I could. And it is fascinating if you study the human body, just any system that you pick out. It's amazing how God has created it with such intricate design. That's exactly what the psalmist must have meant when David said, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And he could recognize that in the long ago. He had not the ability that we do to use a microscope to look at the cellular level in your body and look at the trillions of cells, each one of them programmed to do a different task, and each one of them in itself just a magnificent testimony to God's power and design and intricate creative genius, if we want to call it that. So of the trillions of cells, that testifies to God's greatness. But looking at this spiritual part of man, that part of that is immaterial, if you will, sometimes causes us a bit of frustration because we can't measure it. We can't put it under a microscope, if you will, but it's still very important to consider. And so this morning, we're thinking about man as a social being. Now you might wonder, why is that important? How does that relate to his spiritual well-being? Well, in Genesis 2 in verse 18, you remember that for the first time, God comments that something was not good. Now, if you've read, and I know all of us have, the first two chapters of the book of Genesis, especially in chapter 1, the recurrent comment after God does those things that our imagination is just stretched to the limits to imagine Him doing when He said, let there be light. And there was light. Think of a time when there was no light, and God very simply spoke the words, and there was light. Now that's again, something that our imagination can only begin to try to grapple with. Completing, of course, the creation of the universe and everything in it. The Bible tells us that God, in fact, comments about His work, and it's not bragging. It's simply an accurate evaluation of what He had done. The Bible said in Genesis 1 verse 25, God saw that it was good. It was good, and indeed it was. It was the very first definition of what good is, because God had created it, and that will even tie into this lesson near the end. I'll preview that. Having made man then in His own image, the Bible tells us when we reach chapter 2, which is really retelling much of course, of what had happened in chapter 1, that the Bible said it is not good that man should be alone. And this was a conclusion that Adam himself no doubt had realized, even though he did not record that. At least it's not recorded for us had he made such a comment, because he has been able to name the animals as they were brought to him, and he himself, displaying God's nature within him, is able to dictate or able to in some way use his mind to name the wide variety of animals that were there, but there was not one that was his match, if you will. Here, this is called the Holman Christian Standard Bible. It's a translation probably some of you are not familiar with. I really like how they render Genesis 2 verse 18. I think it really gets to the heart of what the original suggests. It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper, make a helper as his complement. And that's a good way to think about what God is going to do. A helper comparable, a help meet, the old English rendering of that. But the idea is Adam needs someone to complement him. Now there is an important distinction here, and it's sometimes even been my folly to say, for instance, that the woman completed Adam. And that sounds good, but really that would in itself indicate that it would be absolutely essential for us to have a mate, which that's not what the Bible teaches, and many go through life without. What it is telling us, though, is that a helper comparable, man can find his fulfillment in God as an individual, but certainly it's helpful in many cases for many of us to have a helper who can be a complement, who can assist us. And of course, that is the beginning of the marriage relationship in the home, and we'll see that and its importance as we go throughout the lesson. But here, God does not make an error in not creating Eve, at least at the very moment He created Adam. Rather, I think it is for our benefit that God, if you will, demonstrated to Adam His need for her. And likewise, it would be assumed, having no doubt Adam telling Eve how it had happened and how it transpired, what amount of knowledge she was given about the whole ordeal, either innate or by Adam's record, we're not sure, she would recognize. She needed Adam. And Adam complimented her, she complimented Adam, and they are social beings. And so people need people. That's the last sentence there in the first paragraph. And typically, of course, that's true. John Donne, he lived from 1572 to 1631. If you're a fan of literature, you know him as the founder of the Metaphysical Poets. From poetry and literature, he ventured into the religious realm, and the last years of his life was spent as what the Church of England would call the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, the most famous church among those particular adherents of that faith system. You may have visited if you've been in London before. Among his most influential works, this one from his 17th meditation, which he titled Devotions Upon Emergent Occasions. And so you've heard the first phrase, but there's much more to it than that. No man is an island, entire of himself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as any manner of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me. I like that statement. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind. And therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. That's an allusion, of course, to another work of literature in the village, or in the time that he lived, of course, the village church bells would ring upon a death. So when a death occurs, every death affects all of us. No person lives life, as Paul will say in Romans 14, verse 7, no man lives to himself, and no man dies to himself. In chapter 14, Paul is writing really about the idea of how our opinions shape us in Christianity, and it's not maybe proper to compare what John Donne wrote with what Paul wrote, but they're, I think, driving at the same idea. We influence each other, we affect each other, we need each other because we are social beings. Now, that idea of being a social being was expressed even more beautifully maybe by Solomon, the wise king, given that wisdom by God in the long ago. He wrote in Ecclesiastes 4, 9-12, 2 are better than one. Why? Well, he tells you why. Because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. So we understand what here Solomon is also giving us as for instruction, practical counsel. We need people. There's wisdom in doing things, not always just by yourself, but with others. Some know, and especially it seems to affect men more than women, we are more adventurous maybe sometimes, and we set out on certain task without informing others as to what we're going to do, or not thinking we need their assistance, only to find out later that we do, or that we should have included them from the outset. And I think that's what Solomon is here telling us. Behold, but woe to him who is alone when he falls. We need people to help us. We may fall, and like the poor person on the commercial from years gone by, if I've fallen and I can't get up. Well, that's a reality sometimes. No matter our age or health condition, we need others to pick us up. And that may be, of course, not just with a literal physical lifting up, but sometimes just in the troubles of life. Life can knock us down, so we need others to help pick us up. George Livingston said, isolation is unwholesome. By implication, social relationship or fellowship is good. And you don't have to be a social scientist to figure that out. Life and its experiences have taught you that as well. The criminal justice system. I guess it's been a couple of months ago now, Amy and the boys traveled up to Brushy Mountain, one of our local tourist attractions. And I guess if you're watching on YouTube, this is a reason to come visit us here in this region. You can tour the Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. And she said it was a pretty kind of, just kind of almost scary sort of place. But anyways, even in that particular facility, an incarceration facility like that, there was an area where the prisoners would be placed in what is known as solitary confinement. I think they called it up there the hole or something like that. If you visited, Adam could tell us. He was giving me all the details. I didn't get to go with him, but apparently it's just, a place you go and there's a hole in the ground. They open the lid, the door, and throw you in, shut it back, and you have no contact with anyone on the outside. And even you may say, well, prisoners don't have any contact with people on the outside world. That's why they're in there. Well, that's true. But even their contact with one another serves to meet a need. And so when they, I guess, misbehave, or if they are the very worst of offenders, I guess given the particular nature of their crime, they would be placed in an area where they could not have social interaction. And that seen, of course, is a very punitive and serious sort of punishment. It's crucial for all humans to varying degrees. Now, I know you'll find the person from time to time, and all of us, we are told, tend to kind of go along a scale of whether we are introverted or extroverted. And if you don't know what those terms mean, the extroverted person is the person that has to be around people. That's how they draw their energy. That's how they just kind of go through life. That's their fuel for living, so to speak. And they are the life of the party. They're the person that's usually very boisterous and gregarious. And some that are quieter say that's the annoying people in life. Well, perhaps so. Those are the extroverts. On the other end of the spectrum, there's the introverted people. They prefer quiet, calm. They might prefer, just being at home more than being out in a crowd. They might prefer the company of a good book than, being with a lot of other people. But even those people on that end cannot function to their fullest and to their healthiest without some social interaction. Most of us kind of fall somewhere in between those two extremes. And so we know that this is needed. Now, here's the bottom paragraph on your handout. Even without all of these diverse voices and citations of research, so on and so forth, 2020 will always be a year. And I'm wondering, maybe as you are, if 2021 may yet prove in some ways to be the same. That remains, I guess, but you may even want to throw a songbook at me for suggesting it. The disruption and the destruction caused by the COVID-19 virus, the social, isolation that it caused. Now, I put there, and just so you're certain, I want to read it to you. And those that are listening or watching, I want you to listen carefully so that I do not misspeak or you misconstrue what I am saying. Opinions about the entire ordeal and what was good, bad, appropriate, and inappropriate will continue to be debated for years to come. So that's my caveat, if you will. And you're free to do that. I'm not telling you how to think or what's right or what's wrong. That's up for debate. It does appear to many, and I think this is somewhat of a growing consensus, that the restriction of social interaction with family and friends produced more harm and created more problems than it solved. That's my analysis. I could point you to others that concur with that. Some research that suggests that. Some research might be provided to prove just the opposite, or attempt to prove just the opposite. What I would put as forward for my evidence in this particular conclusion, there were tremendous increases in a lot of things that we don't like to think about, but I'm just giving you this for the purpose of showing the value of social interaction and how much we need it. Suicide and self-harm, whether that action was completed, and sadly we have to use the adverb successfully completed, or whether or not that was just simply an attempt to do self-harm to individuals. Again, across all age groups, that number skyrocketed. And sadly, the data is still coming in and it's still being compiled, and there is even some thought in the community that there is a kind of a restricting of this because of certain agendas. Again, I'm not going to try to open up that can of worms, but from what data we are receiving, those numbers just went through the roof, and especially among young people. This was very problematic. Those 30 and under, and then you can even further subdivide it down from that. So it did great damage in that particular area. Mental illness is of all sorts, both their diagnosis as well as those who just simply reported symptoms who did not receive a formal diagnosis or treatment. Those numbers were exponentially higher. Medication, both prescription and narcotic, illegal drug use and misuse is on the rise, and those numbers were very alarming. Child abuse as well as spousal abuse and marital and family dissatisfaction, all of those numbers are up. And what those actual numbers might be, I don't know that we'll ever know, but all of this can again just simply prove what I'm saying already. We need people. And when we are kept away from people for extended periods of time, typically, there are bad results. And so prohibiting normal social interaction at school with family, friends, and other loved ones is likely to have long-term effects that will continue to be felt and seen in various ways for decades. And that's not just my conclusion. Those are what other, especially professionals in the field, are asserting. Well, people need people. Turn to the back page. Why do people need people? Why is it the case that we really do need people? The easy answer, of course, would be simply to say that's how God made us. And that's right, of course. God made us. But interestingly, what I always find I think it's instructive and certainly it's illustrative, is to take the writings or the thoughts, the records of those who really had no close connection with the God of the Bible in history, and yet espouse or try to teach much of what even Scripture teaches. And what that does for me, of course, it just helps show a thread of commonality in that our human nature and needs are very similar. And so one way to do this, to see this universal need for social interaction, might be to cite the Greek philosopher Aristotle. And you've heard his name. Certainly you're influenced by him probably more than you realize. And a couple of his buddies, Socrates and Plato, they're very influential in your life and Western thought and civilization without maybe even your recognition of their being important to you. He said, quote, "A complete community constituted out of several villages, once it reaches the limit of total self-sufficiency, practically speaking, is a city-state." Now, if you go back to history class, the city-state of Athens and then the other city-states in Greece, that's what he's talking about. Now, that's something that gives rise to political theory and democracy and the republic. All of that is not our really focus this morning. Rather, Aristotle goes on, he said, what's the purpose of people gathering together? He said, it comes to be for the sake of living, but it remains for the sake of living well. And he's talking about, of course, a time when people were more segmented and separated, but they come together for the sake of living and living well. And then he goes on to say, there's a little bit of a break. I didn't produce the entire quote for him. And he's saying we should show pity, or we should actually be sad for the individual who is not a part, he would say, of the Greek city-state system. He would be considered clanless, lawless, and homeless. And he said that person should be, in fact, pitied. Now, it's interesting that that same conclusion is much older than Aristotle. If you go back to Genesis 4, the account of Cain and Abel, Cain killing Abel, of course, in his anger, because simply Abel obeyed God and Cain refused. And that's a sad commentary even on human nature itself, that Cain would try to give God what he wanted instead of what God wanted. And he has many, of course, those who have followed him through the centuries and even at the present hour doing likewise. And then in his anger, it leads him to exercise that wrath by taking his brother's life. In verse 9, God calls out, where is Abel your brother? Am I my brother's keeper? And that question, of course, is, of course you are. You are your brother's keeper, Cain. Well, God tells him he was well aware of what he had done. His deed had not escaped God's notice. And now he would be cursed, verse 11, because of his brother's death. You will till the ground, but it will no longer yield its strength to you. Look at the end of verse 12. This is the part I want to focus on. God tells Cain, a fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on the earth. Now that's very curious, really, when you consider the historical context that you have Adam and Eve, you have Cain and Abel. Those are the people. Where are the rest of the people? Well, there are no other people except the people that came from Adam and Eve. It's the old question that people think you can stump the preacher with. Who did Cain marry? There's only two options: his sister or his niece. There's no other options. Genetically, biologically speaking, he didn't marry his mother, so he married his sister or his niece. Now, there's no prohibition against that given the historical circumstances of the time. And yet, as Adam's family begins to reproduce, and as the number of people continue to grow, God tells him at this point, you're going to be a fugitive. That means a separated one. You're going to be a vagabond, one who wanders. You're not going to enjoy the fellowship, the social support that you had before. Look at verse 13. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Isn't that interesting? And he tells us the reason. I don't have it on your handout, but if you have your Bible open there in verse 14, he said, surely you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground. I shall be hidden from your face. Now, what he recognizes properly is that his separation from God. He is probably tying God, as it were, to a particular geographical location where he had previously dwelt with his family. God had met with Adam, certainly not like he did before, driving them out of the garden, but growing up in that home and hearing from his father his relationship with God, Cain might have thought God is just right here. He's nowhere else. Now, that's an incorrect conclusion, of course, but he said, you've driven me and hidden your face from me. We no longer enjoy even that measure of fellowship that we did before. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond. I won't have that support from my family, from others. And they were all family at this point. It will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me. They will not recognize me as friend, but rather as foe. And God goes on to say, whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. The Lord set a mark on Cain, lest anyone finding him should kill him. No one's asked me about that for question and answer tonight, and I'll go ahead and tell you if you do, I don't know what that means. And there have been a number of guesses through the centuries, and I guess any of them are just as likely as the other. I don't know if God, somehow put just a little sign that blinked above Cain's head while he walked around. Don't kill. God said, don't kill me. I don't know. But whatever it was, Cain would be spared from being killed himself, and perhaps that was even worse punishment. He said, I won't have an opportunity to be with my family, to have that social interaction. Paul tells us it was the plan of God for humanity to seek God together. In Acts chapter 17, this is something that I really hadn't thought about much until I began preparing this lesson, and I can't explore it even with the depth that I would like to because of our time constraint this morning. But speaking to the philosophers at Athens, telling them, you remember about the unknown God, in verse 26, the Bible said, He, God, has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, has determined their pre-appointed times, the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for Him and find Him, though He is not far from each one of us. For in Him we live and move and have our being, as also some of our own poets have said, we are also His offspring. Now, I've read that many times, but I was challenged maybe to revisit the idea because Paul says that they should seek the Lord. And you may say, he's just simply speaking collectively. And we speak about they, meaning everyone together, but yet as individuals at the same time. And there is an individual component of our seeking God. I'm not debating that. Absolutely, it's true that accountability, 2 Corinthians 5 verse 10 tells us, will be each one will answer to the Lord for what he or she has done in the body. But maybe there's a component here that the Bible is telling us we can and should try to seek God together. And you could even piggyback this off of the failure to do that properly, for instance, in Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel. Well, all of that, that's interesting, at least for me, maybe not so much for you. Why do people need people? Here's the meat of the lesson, and here's really the part that has something to say about our lives this morning. I know that's what you want to hear. Why do people need people? People need people, number one, because we are made to give and to receive comfort. To give and to receive comfort. Job's friends got that right initially. And the important word there is initially. You remember, God allows Satan to take away everything that Job owned in chapter 1, even his children. And Job remarkably said, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return there. The Lord has given, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. What a pronouncement. He still doesn't curse God like the devil thought. So God permits, God allows. And you can again ask why. That's not the subject of this lesson. But nevertheless, God allows Satan to take away even Job's health. And so in chapter 2, from the top of his head, the bottom of his feet, he has something that probably could just best be described as like a severe burn, maybe blisters. They're so severe all he can do is sit in ashes. Maybe there's some therapeutic benefit from the lime and from that, and scrape himself with a piece of broken pottery. His wife, we often criticize her, but if you've ever watched someone suffer with a terminal disease, especially one that's very painful, I think you have more sympathy for what she requests of her husband. Why do you maintain? Why do you hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. It's a moment of weakness, yes. It's a moment when she felt as if, no doubt, God had forsaken Job, so why shouldn't Job forsake him? Curse God and die. Just put yourself out of your misery. And again, I think we're a bit too harsh on her when we say, things that would perhaps try to impugn her character. Yes, she is in a moment of weakness, saying something even as Job himself comments, you speak as one of the foolish women speak. Shall we not accept, or shall we indeed accept only good and not evil? Or adversity from the Lord? And that word adversity is better than evil that some versions use. In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Verse 11, his three friends, as you might imagine, bad news travels fast. Even in the ancient world it did. So Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar make an appointment. We need to go see our buddy. He's in bad shape. So they make an appointment to come and mourn with him and to comfort him. As they near his residence, or wherever he's at now, perhaps not even in his home proper, but maybe away from it even because of all that's happened, they raised their eyes from afar and did not recognize him. They lifted their voices and wept. Each one tore his robe and sprinkled dust on his head toward heaven. Ancient Near Eastern custom for showing grief and outrage and sorrow. So, verse 13, Job 2, verse 13, so they sat down with him with Job on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his grief was very great. That's the part they did right. Where they mess up is beginning in chapter 4. Eliphaz feels as if he has to say something, and so he begins. And if you read the rest of the book, it is, I guess the right word would be beautiful. It's gut-wrenching to read it. It's infuriating to read the accusations they make against Job, and he even responds in kind. He at one point calls them worthless counselors, all of you. And he said, you must be the wisest guys on earth. You've got everything figured out. I'm the one in the midst of the ash heap here. And so they make false charges against Job. Job even himself questions God, which in itself is not sinful. But it's an amazing book to read and study. Time does not permit us to give a full expose of it for sure. But the point is, the friends did right in wanting to come and comfort him. And by comforting him simply with their presence, they did for him what was needed. When they began to talk and give advice and platitudes, that's when they failed. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, I don't read it at every funeral, but quite often I incorporate it into my thoughts, especially in that setting. Paul said in verse 3, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies," and here's the part I like to focus on, "the God of all," A-L-L, comfort. The God of all comfort. In other words, the simple deduction for us is this: we don't find comfort anywhere other than in God. Now, God can provide that comfort, as verse 4 will show us momentarily, through others, but I cannot turn to anything else, any other source other than God for comfort. All comfort resides in Him, but then Paul does say in verse 4, "who comforts us in all our tribulation, that," here's the reason why, "we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God." When I dispense, when I'm the, if you will, the conduit of God's comfort to others, what a wonderful ministry that is. And so many of you have succeeded through the years in doing that, maybe not even with the full appreciation of what you were doing. But it's a very valuable work. It is a wonderful thing to be a conduit through which God's comfort is dispensed. And the ways that can be done today, again, are many and varied, and you can see those. But people need people because we need comfort. The abstract idea, just to say, well, God provides you with comfort, and then turn and walk away, doesn't help the person. But if I give you a hug, or when you give me a hug, you say, "God loves you and I love you," that's tangible. That does something mentally, even though I'm a social being and that's a part of me that's immaterial. That physical does something that pairs it together in a marvelous fashion. So people need people to comfort each other. People need people for courage and for strength. All of these are interrelated. You may be thinking to yourself, you're saying the same thing three different ways, and maybe I am, but maybe there's a little bit of a nuance of difference. We need people to supply us with strength and courage. It's easy to go from hero to zero, from the mountain to the valley. And if you need proof of that, Elijah at Mount Carmel is your textbook example. Challenging the wicked prophets of Baal. Go ahead and call on your God. And then the humor that ensues with him telling, that is Elijah telling these false prophets about their God Baal. Maybe he's asleep, maybe he's on vacation. The Hebrew, even though we don't usually like to think about it because we think it being a little bit off color, Elijah says maybe he's in the bathroom. That's what the original Hebrew suggests to me by those who have studied it more in detail than I have. Your God's not available. He don't care. He's impotent. He's powerless. And he was, because he wasn't real. Elijah builds his altar. He inundates it with water, you remember. Says, "God, show him who's," if you'll allow me the liberty, "show him who's boss." And he does. Fire falls from heaven, destroys everything. And so the people say, that's the God we want to serve. That's the true God, and he was. Those false prophets put to death. King Ahab doesn't care much, though, for that, and so he puts a death warrant out on Elijah. You would think that having witnessed all of that, Elijah would have just walked straight up to the king and said, "Bring it on, big boy. I just saw what God did, so go ahead, give me your best shot. Because that God that just did that, he's the God that I serve. He's on my side, or better said, I'm on his side. I would think maybe if I were in that situation and I were Elijah, that would be what I would have done. Or maybe I would have done exactly what Elijah did. He runs away. And in chapter 19, he just kind of in a depressive mood said, there's no one left. No one cares. I'm the only one. God shows him otherwise. And that entire account itself, like we said about Job, I wish we could explore more. But people need people. We need courage and strength. Sometimes we just need someone to put their arm around us to say, you can do it. Now, they're not going to do anything other than tell us those 4 words, you can do it. But somehow that helps us immensely. And the number of people that have done that for me through my life is a list longer than I can possibly even know myself. But I appreciate each one. People need people to supply strength and courage. Number 3, people need people because of influence. Iron sharpens iron, the wise man said, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. That's positive. And we are thankful for those who have helped us be better. Negatively, we are warned evil company corrupts good habits or good morals, good manners. 1 Corinthians 15:33. And so we have to recognize that influence can go either way, good or bad, positive or negative. Proverbs 27 verse 6, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. Those that help us sometimes have to hurt us to help us. And by that hurt, I mean they have to point out flaws, they have to point out shortcomings, they have to show us a better way. And I'll admit in my younger years, I didn't want to do that for people. I was scared to do that for people. I didn't want to risk, what if I make them mad? But as I've tried to develop and deepen relationships with people since that time, I tell them, I love you and that's why I'm telling you this. You're not in the right, or you're wrong, or you might need to think about changing this or that. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. So people need people to give and receive comfort, to supply strength and courage, to positively influence one another. You can add to that list, and again, a lot of those are kind of very similar, I recognize, but we need each other. How has God provided for man's social needs? There are 3 ways, and you know these. God provided for man's social needs through marriage in the home, the first institution given by God. Brother Warren, who I've quoted frequently in this study because he's very much an expert in all of these matters. He said marriage is not a relationship whereby the 2 partners stand with their backs to one another, each using marriage for his or her own selfish purposes. Neither is marriage to be pictured by 2 persons facing one another so that they worship one another. They are to worship God, not one another. Instead of these 2 erroneous views, marriage is best considered as 2 people standing side by side facing toward heaven with the resolve to help one another walk closer to God. All of the various aspects of marriage should be pointed toward this goal. I love that statement. Marriage is about me helping my spouse get to heaven. Number 1, primary, most important. Everything else secondary to that. We've just returned from a week at church camp, and almost every summer at church camp when I have an opportunity to speak to the high school kids and they want to know something about dating this person or dating that person, what if I can? They don't go to church, and I tell them to be very cautious. And I tell them your number 1 criteria, they better check this box, and if they check this box, none of the rest of them matter. If they will help you get to heaven, then that's a person worth pursuing. And I'm not saying you can't have relationships or friendships or associations with those who are not God's people. Clearly we must to try to teach them. But when it comes to investing emotionally and romantically in a person with the idea of this person becoming your husband or wife, if they are a person that will not help you each day get to heaven, you better move on to someone who will. That's so important. Government has provided for man's social needs. Now that's a little bit of a stretch, you might say, but it's the idea that they provide, as Aristotle mentioned, a place for the city-state for people to dwell together, to avoid chaos, to hopefully promote law and order. Now I know you can say, that's not happening today, preacher. Well, again, that's another debate for another time and place, but certainly the purpose and role of government, God says, is that they do not bear the sword in vain. They are a minister of God to especially punish evildoers, to provide some measure of protection. I know you would say sometimes that's clearly lacking. I would concur. But even government itself was designed for that purpose. And then finally, the church can help meet the social needs of mankind. This little building, this is what I always think of when I think of church way back when. I preached here one Sunday a month, I guess, during my junior year of high school. It's just over the hills and hollers from where I grew up. No air conditioning in this building, no indoor plumbing. There's an outhouse behind the building that you cannot see. The little sheds on the side are recent additions as well as the gas tank that wasn't there, just a potbelly wood stove, but was what I remember. But we think of church as just being a building or a place. It's not that, of course. The one another passages in the New Testament say that's what we are to be. We are the people that love one another, that comfort one another, that support one another, that encourage one another. John Eldridge, whose name you probably don't recognize, he's a counselor that writes from a Christian perspective, sadly not a New Testament Christian perspective. But I read one of his works this past week, and it was very insightful. He talked about his work. He said, I'm a counselor, I'm a therapist. That's what I do. I write books and I counsel people. That's how I feed my family. And he said, but the very reason why I'm needed is because the church has failed to be what it should be in supporting and helping one another as the people of God. And I thought that was quite insightful, and I believe very true. That's what we need to be for each other. We must do that more than just 1 hour a week or a couple of hours on Sunday or even coming back on Wednesday to just interact with each other in passing. That requires some investment throughout the week, and we all need to look to see how we might be able to do that even better than we do currently. Man is a social being. Indeed, we are. And we hope this lesson has helped you appreciate that and even think about how you might improve in that area to help others, even your fellow Christians, with their social needs that they have. Thank you for your good attention this morning. Next week, the Lord willing, we'll study man being an ethical being. What does it mean that we are ethical beings? Well, come back then. We'll study that, the Lord willing. Thank you for being with us this morning.